Yo, this is the track breakdown for my song Pure Cold, out now on the All By Myself EP, which you can listen, right now. So go do that after you've watched this video, of course. As with every other track breakdown I've made, I'm going to go over everything that went into making this song. This was actually the first song I made for the EP, and the idea for it came about after watching another one of these Aftertouch audio videos, specifically this one. That's why it's called Pure Cold. I wanted to have some icy sound design within it, which at the time I didn't really do too well, but the idea of using some sort of element in my sound design kind of came to fruition within Aquabolt. The breakdown for that video was out like a couple days ago, so watch that as well. Anyways, getting into it, after deciding I was going to make this song, I decided to use this melody that I made in this project file maybe like a couple months ago, which, that's where the melody came from. And I decided I wanted this song to be kind of like drum and bass, so let's get into it. First of all, I have a couple transition sounds from the silence of nothing to the intro. First of all, this glass impact, which is just made out of, glass sample. And that's got just kind of a pretty hefty reverb on it. There's some OTT to bring out some extra high end, taking out all the low end, putting a delay through a reverb just to make it as wide and delayed as possible. And that's paired with these two impacts. Going into the intro, I also have the sub bass, which is kind of just like any other sub bass. This one's a sine wave with some white noise, full tube distortion, and then a low pass. And I'm using this LFO as an envelope to create a pluck. And then on top of that, I have a Reese bass, which is just a standard Reese bass. Two saw waves, one of which is an octave higher. They're both pretty low and with unison, taking out the low and high end, putting it through an OTT, and then taking out more low and high end just to make sure there's no sub and it's not too gritty, I guess. Together, those make the, bass of the song. Then I've got a pad, which I've actually rendered out, but if I'm going to turn these back on. And that's using the chord progression I made for the song. So what I've got here, this is a bell sound, and I'm putting it through a granulator, and that's in combination with what is effectively a granulized triangle wave, and I'm getting the randomness from this processing down here. That is then going through two different types of delays just to make it wider. This crystallizer, which is then going through a low pass, and then it's also going through a delay, which is then going through a Valhalla Supermassive, and that's all going into an EQ, taking out all the highs and the lows, and then that's going into another low pass and a fruity balance to make sure I can get this filter up here. There's also this pitch shift because I thought it sounded cool, and then once again I rendered that out. Then I took the same chord progression and put it into these plucks here. This also has a low pass filter and fruity balance on it. So this is starting out with a serum, and I can barely tell what's going on, but it's just a bunch of different wave types, and there's some modulation within them, including volume, this syncopation and wavetable position, more volume, and this cutoff, and that's got a compressor on it. And then that's going through an EQ, taking out all the lows and some of the highs, then through a delay with reverse forwards, which means it's delaying both in reverse and normally. That's then going through a mid-side EQ, and then the most important one, the serum effects, which is giving the pluck that I wanted. And that's both on the level and cutoff for this EQ here, this low pass. And that low pass is also increasing and decreasing in cutoff slowly over time. And that's got a, compressor on it. Then that goes through another compressor, and this is just turning it down slightly. Once again, I have the pitch shift on it, and this volume just cuts out from the intro to the break. And I also have the low pass on it, again, filtering it in for the intro. Then I have the all-important lead, which is just a pulse width, and I have a vibrato kind of turning up over time, and that is parallel processed with this reverb, which is just a Valhalla Supermassive, and this fruity balance I will talk about in a second. All the low end is getting cut out, and some of the highs, and then that's also going to be low passed, and the volume is going to be messed with. I don't know what's up with this. I think it's just turning it down a little bit. Same with this one here. And then for some drums in the intro, I had a recording of a bunch of utensils, so I kind of chopped that up. and use those. And then those are going through this patcher over here. Essentially what this all is doing is increasing the volume and transients and then splitting the low and high frequencies. So the low frequencies are getting distorted a little bit and the high frequencies are getting reverbed and then reprocessed to make sure it's not too stereo wide with this mid-side EQ over here. And that also has a filter on it. And then I just have some crashes here. Getting into the buildup here, I created this kind of flow. Because that's essentially the flow I wanted within the drop, so I thought I might as well use it in the buildup. First of all, that interlude is just playing the lowest notes that it was in the beginning, and I took out all these slides. And this is controlling the volume right here to make sure it's cut out when those basses are playing. And then on the second half here, it just starts playing the normal lead melody. And then here I take out all the reverb. Going over the drums real quick. This kick is pretty thumpy, but I also added an extra transient on top of it. And then I have a snare and clap combo, which has even more claps during the build-up. And then I have ride cymbals playing and also this crash, which I have chopped up a little bit just to make sure it made sense. Along with that, I have this drum fill, which is just made from a bunch of toms that I had. Over here, I decided to add a piano, which is, of course, not just a piano, but it's kind of the gist of it. I don't know why this fresh air isn't working, but whatever. I've got this flex piano, which is going through an ozone imager, taking out all of the stereo width. That's going through an OTT and a sound godizer, and then through this EQ to shape it up a little bit, take out all the low end and whatnot. And then that's going through a serum effects, which is putting that wideness back into the sound. And then that's paired with this sort of super square, I guess, which is essentially just a pluck made out of a detuned square wave. Just a normal square wave at a lower octave and then saw wave up to, and then multi-band compressor and taking out all the low end. And then those are both going through this EQ just to shape it up a little bit and then out into FL Studio. With that, I have this bass that I made quite a little bit ago. It's basically a saw wave, which is vocoded to a bent saw wave, and that's going through some OTT and a fat rack. And then that is once again going through another fat rack and high and low pass, taking out all the lows and dampening the high end because it's kind of just being used as a layer for the actual sub bass. Then I have that rendered out. The reason it looks like this is because I forgot to take out the side chain when I rendered it, so you know. And then I have this growl, which I believe is the growl from my growl tutorial, which many people have watched, I guess. And then I'm just kind of messing with that. And then that is being parallel processed with a resonator, which has some dimension expander on it and just shaping it up with an EQ. And then that's all being compressed. And then what I've done is I've taken just the growl by itself and rendered it out so I could kind of chop it up a little bit because it was boring just being how it was, you know. Then I have the sub bass, which is essentially a copy and paste of the first sub bass, except I have it kicking a lot more. So this is on the gain here. And then I also have this LFO on the master tune. So it has more kick to it. Then that's going through a fat rack and shaping it with an EQ, just taking all the high end so it's not too harsh. And then I have this glass sample, which has quite a few stuff on it, but basically taking out all the low end, making it completely mono, quickly painting it left and right. That's going into a dimension expander. This fresh air would have turned up the high end a little bit, and that's being parallel processed with a couple of retunes, which is like pitch map, and that's going into an OTT and back out. And then of course I have that rendered because retune takes up a lot of CPU. And then over here, just before the drop, I have this reverse from Barely Alive, which, you know, sounds like that. And then some reversed impacts and the glass as well. And that's the whole build-up. Oh, wait. I also have two risers, both of which I made in Serum, I think. The first riser is made out of triangle wave, and I have the detune and pitch increasing over time. As you can see, I'm controlling the pitch with just the pitch knob right here. And that's going through some multiband compression and a reverb. And then I have this other one, which as you can see is just white noise that's being filtered in with a band pass. I think I forgot to add, but this is one of the 3 songs within the All By Myself EP in which I entirely planned out the song beforehand, including all the drops. I probably did that like a month beforehand, so I knew exactly how the song was going to sound before I even made it. I just had to execute, if you will. So I just had to put that into, dubstep basses, and that's exactly what I did, starting off with the sub bass. I actually have 2 here because the main bass of the first half of the first drop requires this thump type sound. Otherwise, it didn't sound right. So the first sub, which is the weaker one, is I think that same patch. I just kind of duplicated it from the last sub that I mentioned, and that's going through an overdrive, just a bit of it. And then the second one, this is the main patch that I use for my sub basses, which is just effectively the same thing, except I'm using an envelope on the master tuning here, and it's up quite a bit. Tube distortion with drive all the way up, mix at 62%, and then this EQ is boosting the low end. I think there's some extra processing on this. I am wrong. There's no extra processing on that. So I guess I just have the envelope on that master tuning up quite high to get that extra thumpiness. And so the first bass I made for this was this chord bass here. And as you can see, this is my typical color bass processing, which looks more complicated than it actually is. I have this Vital as the initial patch, which is not going to load. That's not good. Yeah, I don't know why Vital does this sometimes, but with my computer, it literally does not load the UI for the patch here. So I wish I could show you what I did, but I'm pretty sure I'm just using the inharmonic stretch option again and turning that into a kind of pluck. Doesn't sound like I have any extra processing on it through Vital itself. So then that's going through a Serum Effects, which is giving it more filtering with a band reject and this EQ over here, which is giving it a very interesting sound. If I turn those off, it's going to sound completely different. And then that's going through a compressor and some hyperdimension to give some wideness. That's then going through an OTT and an EQ to shape it up a bit. And once again, I have the resonator as well, which is going through an OTT and some reverb and then some EQ shaping. And that's just playing the chords that I chose a couple months ago for that specific bass. And then along with that, there's this other one, which is using the MIDI from those chords. This is just to give it some extra high-end type pew noise. So that's using a 1/2 synced, what is that, like a square wave, I think? And then this Prism Table from AU5. And then it's got this aggressive high pass filter. Same here, but then all the high end gets kind of taken out into multiband compression. That's going through an EQ for some shaping. And those are all layered together, going through another EQ, boosting the high end, taking out all the lows. And that's going through a mid-side EQ, just boosting the width a little bit. And then that's being parallel processed with a reverb whose volume is being controlled by this fruity balance, because I want it to just be a reverb swell. And then immediately after that, there's a sort of frequency shifted arpeggio, which I actually learned from an AU5 donation course. This is taking a couple bell samples I have, putting it through a bunch of processing, which is basically just shaping it up, making sure there's high end with this bit crusher, some distortion, and boosting the high end a little bit more. And then that goes into a dual delay and reverb and compressor. And that's going through some delay and reverb and a compressor to make sure it's the right volume. And the main thing that's going on here is this pitch shifter and frequency shifter combination, which if I turn those off, it's just a normal arpeggio, but I'm going from all the way at the bottom and turning those up over time, which gives it that kind of sound. Pitch shifter actually has its mix down to 32%, so it's just a higher extra layer. It's not pitch shifting at all. But then that's going through an OTT, some EQ shaping, parallel process with a reverb into another EQ, which is just turning it down ever so slightly, mid-side EQ, and its volume is getting controlled with this fruity balance because I didn't want it to ring out too long. I'm actually going to go over this main bass after I go through the other one. So there's this growl here, which is a pretty small one. This is pretty typically how I make a growl. I'm taking a couple wavetables. This one happens to be remapped ever so slightly. And this one is, I'm not sure what, I don't think this is actually doing anything because it's level, oh, it's so low. But it's not 0. So this is just adding some extra high end. It's FMing from this first one. And then I have a band pass, which is the main thing you need for a growl. because the extra higher frequencies are going to be effectively put back in with distortion later. And that's going through a phaser and another filter, which are being controlled by this macro. And that's going through some compression and distortion, and then more compression, even more compression, more distortion, dimension expander, mid-side EQ, turning down the side a little bit, and then a final EQ just to boost the mids. And then that is going through a snap heap. This snap heap is being used to parallel process. So I have one half going through a bit crusher, and that's being high passed and distorted just to give some extra high end when combined with the normal one. And then that's being put through a retune at E minor and a final EQ just to shape it up. And then I have the growl's pitch and the growl itself being controlled by these here. And there's another one right here. Next up is just a piano, you know. It's a piano, which is just the grand piano from Flex with some OTT and some overdrive. That's then going through a dimension expander, a mid-side EQ, and some EQ shaping to make sure it cut through the mix properly. And that's just playing all D notes. There's this sort of reso bass here, which is a sine wave. I have this envelope LFO on the pitch that's going through full distortion and multiband compression. And then that's being parallel processed with a resonator going into a reverb. And then finally for the main synth for this area, which consists of a top layer. This top layer is just some saw waves. Two saw waves, which are each playing a sort of, I guess, harmony of each other. And they've both got the portamento up to about halfway. Those are then going through an EQ, taking out all the lows and dampening most of the highs. And OTT going into a kilohertz ensemble to give it some wideness, and then a mid-side EQ, turning down the side a little bit. And then I have the mid bass. And then that's just this Reese Mess wavetable in combination with a saw wave, which is going through tube distortion, multiband compression, taking out some of the lows and highs. This filter is off, so this thing doesn't matter right here. And then this is on the master pitch, I believe. Yeah. And then that's going through a kilohertz ensemble, a mid-side EQ, and I guess I'm turning it up with this fruity balance here. And then I have a bunch of samples here. First of all, I have a glass sample. I have another glass sample. And then I have another glass sample. And then I have another glass sample. That was kind of supposed to emulate Ice, and then putting them together to sound like this. You know, Ice. And then I have that layered with this. It sounds like I'm using inharmonic stretch again. I might be using the random amplitudes function. One or the other, I don't know. Vital is not loading once again, so I guess we'll never know, will we? And then on that, there is this patcher here. There's an ozone imager taking away all these stereo width. That's going through an OTT. I don't know what this frequency shifter is for. It doesn't look like it's doing anything at all. Taking out all the low end and doing some minor EQ shaping. It's going through a Serum Effects, which looks like it just has some tube distortion on it. And then finally a compressor to make sure it's not too loud. And then that is being processed again through another EQ, crystallizer, and what was once a fresh air, turning the high end up. That crystallizer is just giving it some stereo width. And then all these glass samples are being processed with this vocoder layer. And what they're being vocoded with is actually pretty weird. It's once again the chords that I chose, but I guess I chose a pretty weird wavetable, and that has a low pass filter on it. That looks like that's it. And then that is of course being vocoded to the glass. And the modulator pitch shift is being turned up over time. And then I have this patcher, I'm messing with this peak here, which is just slowly going up to kind of accentuate the movement. That's going into an OTT and then a low pass and some extra EQ shaping. And then there's also a resonator layer, which is, you know, that's a resonator, right? And that's going through almost the exact same processing. And then those are both going into this melodic processing here, which without that, you know, they don't sound too good. Then I put them through this, which is a bunch of parallel buses. First of all, I have another kind of bit crusher high pass parallel processing bus here, which is just to give some extra high end. And then there's also a layer with a detuned ensemble on it. Along with that, this bit crusher is being turned up and down with this LFO here. And then I have all of that going into this snap heap with the 10 dispersers. I'm pretty sure I've talked about this countless times before. That is then going into an EQ with some minor shaping, and then finally a compressor just to finish it off. I also have this layer right here, which is just a triangle and saw wave pluck. Nothing really special with that one. And those are all being put together here. We have the final processing, which is a high pass to take out all the low end, a reverb, which I'm controlling with this wet level here. That's actually parallel processed, so I can EQ the reverb, and then a fruity balance, turning it down slightly. And then I have this section right here, which I think I change ever so slightly later. I might be wrong with that, but I have the build-up bass. I have these chords. If I can find them. Yeah, right here. So this is semi-complicated, but basically what it is a bunch of chord stack layers, and I'm parallel processing that with a reverb. And then there's also this lead. I don't know why I didn't use the layer thing, you know, this one for this part for this lead, but it consists of 3 parts. There's the main part here, which is those bells from earlier. I guess they ring out quite a bit because I have the glide on, which means I can do stuff like that. That's then being layered with this serum. And the basis of this is that it's using the chaos modulations on the coarse pitch of each of these saw waves, which makes it pretty gritty. And then I have this one here, which is just a triangle wave. One of them has an octave up, and that's got some reverb on it. And that's all the synths for the first half of the drop. And then for the second half of the drop, I have these 2 basses continuing, but now the piano is playing some extra stuff. I've got another growl here, which looks complicated again, which is 2 layers. I'm pretty sure these layers are almost identical, but basically I've made a growl mainly out of this wavetable here, and it sounds like that. You know, I think this would be a little bit too complicated to go over just for the sake of time. So that's going through a fat rack and then some EQ shaping, and that's being parallel processed with what is the exact same thing. I have these 2 off though, and then that's going through normal growl processing and then a retune, which is then being put through a wider for some stereo width. This is just dampening that a bit, more EQ shaping, and together those sound like that. And then I have these other sort of mildly irrelevant basses just to fill some space. This one looks like just a saw wave or 2. If I can find it, yeah, here. Yeah, it's just a saw wave, or I guess 3 saw waves, because these volumes are actually up kind of. So there's one here, there's a sine wave just as the lower layer, and then another saw wave at +7 semitones. That's going through a distortion, some EQ shaping, and a wider. Then I've got this bass, which is another semi-complicated one. This vital is not going to open. Okay, I can't tell you how I made this one though, but I think what's going on is just, it's kind of like any other bass, but I'm using the multi-band compressor within vital and then the chorus as well. Then I've got this bass here, which is the main bass for this half of the drop. First of all, I've got this growl here, one of which has this layer here, one of which has this layer. I'm pretty sure this is a resampled wavetable. I probably had the FM on it, and that's going through a phaser. And I'm taking out all the low end on that because this is just for the high end. And then I have this bass over here, which is pretty much the exact same thing, except I have more specifically with this EQ here, and that's going through a band pass and multi-band compression, and then typical growl processing, 3 OTTs, 3 more OTTs, a fat rack, and EQ shaping, taking out pretty much all the high end because that is being occupied by this bass here, and then that is going through this processing, which has yet another phaser on it, and a multi-band compressor and some distortion, and then that's being layered with another one here. Which, yeah, this is just the exact same patch as before, except an octave higher. That is then going through here, which is an EQ for more EQ shaping. That's being parallel processed with a hyperdimension with the mix all the way up. That's being turned down a bit, as you can see here, and then some mid-side EQing. And then that is also fully being parallel processed with this resonator here. This resonator is taking its input instead of from a chord, it's from an arpeggio. This one right here. Just because I thought it sounded cool, and then that's got some extra EQ shaping on it. And then that is going through this pretty large chord here. It's a pulse width. And I've got an LFO on the level, and then that's going through a reverb. This fruity balance is just to control the release of the sound. So that's being vocoded to that growl with a vocodex, obviously. And then that has some EQ shaping. And then a mid-side EQ, lowering the side information just slightly. And that is being parallel processed with the original growl. And on top of that, I have a couple extra sounds. For one, this lead, which is just a 3x oscillator. I have two sine waves. They are 4 octaves apart. I'm putting distortion on that, and then this EQ shape and some dimension expander. And there's also the arpeggio, just normal, with another vital that I can't open. Wish I could tell you what that was, but I cannot. And it's going through a fruity reverb and just taking out the high and low end. And then they all together come, and then all together they sound like this. Oh, I forgot to mention in the first drop, or in the second half of the first drop over here, I have a sine wave kind of pluck layer, which is just that. It's a sine wave with some white noise, and it's plucked, and that's going through a delay and this fruity balance just to turn it down in volume. I then have this section starting out with this lead, which is a very plucky and pewy patch. I don't know how to describe this. I'm gonna turn the what's it called off again. But basically what I'm doing is I'm plucking it and I'm putting this kind of envelope on stuff that is going to change the pitch really quickly, giving it that pew kind of sound. And that's going through a fruity overdrive and some EQ shaping here. And that is being double parallel processed with a delay and a crystallizer to give it some width. And then with that, I have these chords, which are very simple. It's just a couple of sounds, a couple bells. I have this bell and a granulator, and then some supplementary wavetables. And it's being plucked with this gain here, and pretty much all of the gains of each of these, besides the plucks, I guess. And then that is going through a transient shaper, which is being parallel processed with this thing over here, which is just a reverb, which is 3 reverbs, just a normal fruity reverb, a crystallizer, which is going through a reverb, and then a delay. And then that reverb's volume is being controlled by this here. And then that is finally going through this right here, which is an OTT, a compressor, and an EQ to make sure it doesn't get too loud. And then finally, I can go over the drums for this section. First of all, I'm using a couple different kicks. This is the main one right here. It's a kick. And I have this kind of flow for the snares. And then for the second half, I have these extra little transients on the snares. And then in both the first and second half of the drop, the secondary section is a completely different flow from the initial section. And then I have some cymbals, And then as you can see, for the first half of the drop, I have these snares going quite fast, and then I kind of have them in the second half. And then finally, for the transition from the first drop to the break, I guess, I have these low passes happening. So there's one on the sub bass. Actually, it looks like this is just on the volume, yeah. And then there's one on this bass over here, which is the only bass playing at the time, along with the drums. Okay, so I'm actually going to go over the second drop before I go over the break and second buildup and the outro and whatnot. So I don't have everything at the correct volume here, but it's pretty much exactly what it needs to be. Either way, second drop, first bass. Oh, I can actually open this one now. That's ideal. So the first bass is just using a bunch of wavetables at -36 semitones. And then the wavetable position and the harmonic stretch and inharmonic stretch of these are being controlled by this one right here. That's going into a multi-band compressor, a soft clipper, and this little delay just to add some extra width. And that is going into a fat rack and some EQ shaping. And I'm boosting the width of it as well. And then that is being parallel processed with a resonator and vocoder. This vocoder is using this patch here, which is a triangle, square, and sine wave. Those are being EQ shaped, right? Those have EQ shaping on them, and then they're both going into the serum effects to give it some stereo width. And then the dry signal and the color-based signal are going into another serum effects, which is just kind of this high pass thing right here. And then that's going into a multi-band compressor, some more EQ shaping, and then finally out to FL Studio. And that doesn't have any extra processing on it, but that is using the chords I chose for this specific bass. The next one is this one right here, which is quite interesting. Ugh. yet another pretty large patch. This is using a couple of wavetables here. Most of the movement is just coming from these wavetable positions, and that has distortion and compression on it. That's going through 3 OTTs, fat rack, and then that's then going into this serum effects to get some stereo width through some EQ shaping. This ozone imager to make sure it's not too wide, and then out through the final EQ shaping, which is parallel processed with a vocoded layer using just 2 saws, one of which is 7 semitones up. That's going through a vocodex, and then the serum effects here, taking out the low end and adding some stereo width, which is then going through an OTT, some, EQ shaping, and then that's being parallel processed with this reverb here, which is just a fruity reverb and a delay combination, and that's all going into, once again, this EQ to boost some of the low mids. And I have this other layer, which is just, I believe, a 7th up and then an octave above that. So it sounds like that. And then the modulator pitch shift for the vocodex is being turned down over time. The next one is these chords. This is a vital. Anyways, I have a couple of wavetables here, and they're just kind of plucking some harmonic and inharmonic stretch. This is ring modded as well. This one is at -36, and these two right here are at -24. Let's go through some multiband compression, then into 3 OTTs, a fat rack. The serum effects is giving some stereo width. That's going into a mid-side EQ, probably decreasing some. Just taking out some of the low mid side information. That's going into some EQ shaping, and then that is being parallel processed out of this fat rack into a vocodex, which is also being parallel processed with the carrier, and the vocodex and the carrier are going into an OTT and sound guidizer, and then some EQ shaping that's being parallel processed with a reverb. All of that goes into this EQ and then out to FL Studio. This serum over here is, it's interesting. And that's taking an output from this MIDI out over here, which is playing these chords, making it sound like this. I also have this pretty interesting sound from this peak going up over time. And that's that bass right there. And then I have that kind of a bit crushed growl from earlier, just as an extra layer. And then I've got this lead and chord layer. Going over the lead first. This is pretty simple. I think this is just the same lead from earlier, the first lead that I made, and it's just got some pitch bend with it. And then for some final processing, I have 3 OTTs and some EQ shaping as well. For these chords here, I've got another grand piano from Flex, which is going through an ozone imager to take out all the side information, sound guidizer, OTT, EQ shaping, and then some stereo width with a hyperdimension. And that is being paired with this serum, which is kind of like which is a super square, I guess. And there's this other one here, which is just the same thing, except with less detune. And those are all going through an OTT parallel process with a delay and then some EQ shaping. And then I have this extra bass here, which is just a growl, which just looks needlessly complicated. It's not actually that complicated. Most of the movement is coming from this here. I could not possibly tell you how I came up with this wavetable because it's not anything I would get from, one of these packs, or at least I don't think. I might be wrong about that. Either way, it's pretty standard growl stuff. I've got bend plus on it, and I'm doing some stuff with the wavetable position. And then I've also got a band pass that's going through a multiband compressor, and there's some extra filtering with this EQ and a phaser that's going through 3 OTTs, another 3 OTTs, and a fat rack, and then some EQ shaping into this sound guidizer, and some more EQ shaping into a Fruity Blood overdrive that is then going into the serum effects to make it more stereo wide. And I'm also putting another OTT on it, basically. That's then going into more EQ shaping. And then this thing right here, which is just a mid-side EQ connected to a serum effects, which is just basically a brick wall limiter. I know it's a compressor, but it's a limiter. And I'm controlling the pitch bend with this right here. And then that is finally going into this patcher here, which is parallel process with a retune at E minor. Kind of actually have these couple of notes put up a little bit just because I wanted a specific chord. I think that's all the bases for this area. Yeah. Moving on to the next project file. For the drop drums, I just have an ever so slightly different rhythm to them. Nothing too substantial though. And And then I've effectively copy and pasted the buildup. So, you know, that's almost exactly the same, except the specific melody that's being played here with this lead. Everything else is essentially the same. And then for the break, that's where it's actually different. So first of all, from the first drop, I have this kick, which is kind of just duplicated and made smaller with this length and out knob, which is just duplicated and made smaller with this out knob. And then there's also a crash here as well. The lead is being filtered in and out slowly until the buildup where it kind of swells in completely. I also have the sine pluck for the break, which is, I'm pretty sure I already went over this, but sine wave, some noise, it's a pluck, delay, and I'm turning it down quite a bit. And he's got some extra processing over here, which is just a mid-side EQ. I then have the intro pad, which has returned. And then I have another one. I don't exactly know how I made this one. Oh, but I can actually look. This pad sounds like it was made using the, damn, I don't know. I might have to look back on that. I don't know how I made this pad, but it's got some EQ shaping, a crystallizer, and a fruity reverb on it. And the volume of this pad is being controlled, so it goes down over time. The sub is back, and its volume is also being controlled. So from this break to the build-up, pretty much everything swells up to increase the energy. And then the main thing in this part of the song is my piano here. Right here, I'm using these slide notes to slide from no volume to full volume. And then, you know, the piano itself. We're just playing the chords here. These ones are very simple. And then the chords get more complicated as we get closer to the build-up. And then here I have a kind of strummed chord going all the way up to D9, and I'm using the so-called mega piano, which is just a flex grand piano going into the piano processing, which is significantly dampening the side information going into an OTT, and then what would have been a fresh air, but my fresh air doesn't work right now for some reason. This is, I think, lowering, or it's either lowering or boosting the low-mid side information. I would assume it's just lowering it, and then some EQ shaping, boosting the high mids. That's going into a dimension expander, and another EQ for EQ shaping. That's being parallel processed with this reverb, which I've mentioned before, and that's going into a compressor just to control the volume. And then finally into another EQ, boosting the high end significantly so it could cut through the mix more, and then a mid-side EQ to get rid of all of the low-end side information. And that swells into the buildup. And once again, the buildup is almost identical to before, except just these notes up here. Already went over the drop here. Some of the volumes of things has been changed. That's pretty much it though. Oh, along with that, I have these chords right here, which are the drop chords from before. These ones right here. Just as a supporting layer for the pre-drop, I guess. I've already gone over the first half of the second drop. Besides the subs are the same as for the first drop. I'm just using them as needed. And then for the second half of the second drop, we start off with this bass. Just as the supporting bass, just as a supporting bass. This is a serum with bright white noise, a saw wave at -2, and another saw wave at +7 semitones, full tube distortion, and OTTs. That's going through 3 OTTs, fat rack, EQ shaping, and a mid-side EQ. And that's finally going out into this right here, which is probably, yeah, it's a low pass, which is used over here. And then I have this pad here. And I'm using these chords I came up with. Which I wish I could tell you what's going on here, but once again, I have no clue, as per usual. And what I've done with these chords, they're actually not playing out of this piano there, but they are playing out of this serum, which is just a super saw layered with a saw wave 1 octave down that is not detuned at all, and that has delay and reverb on it, which is then going into a crystallizer and has some final EQ shaping, just as a pad to, you know, pad the area. And it's playing an arpeggio of the chords, which are right here, actually. There's a sort of transition with this chord here. Going into it, it is, once again, this thing right here, which is just using a bunch of super saws. This one is that one with the chaos modulation to make it quite a bit grittier. Another super saw, and then a lower kind of saw layer. And then that's all going through some EQ shaping and a mid-side EQ. This EQ shaping to make sure there's space for the lead, which is right here. It's just the main lead that I have throughout pretty much the entirety of the song. Same patch and everything, except I guess this reverb, yeah, this reverb is quite a bit shorter. And then I have that layered with the chaos modulation thing. And that has quite a bit of processing on it. Taking out all the low end, putting a reverb on it, mid-side EQing. This frequency shifter is for this right here. And then I have this fruity balance, which is being controlled by these automation clips down here. And then finally, I've got pretty much the same like frequency shifted ARP from before. Playing the chords that I have chosen out for that section. And then finally the outro. I had a section here, but I decided to skip it, just go straight for the very end, which has that kick again, no sidechain on that kick. And then I have the plucks here, which are decreasing in volume over time. I have the main outro lead, which is filtering out with this filter here. Those pads have returned, and I have a cold breaks pad as well, which is, volume filtered. And those are being filtered and volumed. The volume of all of those are going down. Don't have any basses in this section, no sub bass either, and I have some effects over here as impacts. And then finally the piano, which is identical to the piano before, except I have some extra chords. I just kind of squash that. And then I have these chords here. I believe this is a, what is it? An E dominant chord? I might be wrong about that, but I have a transition from this chord to this one, which is this one right here. And these are kind of out of sync with the BPM just because I thought it sounded cool. So that's it for the song. And then if I go to the mastering real quick, it's all pretty simple. Just an Ozone 9. This EQ is taking out all the low end side information just to make sure this exciter is not even on. There's another EQ boosting the low end. This imager, not even on. And then I have a limiter and maximizer to make sure it's the right volume and it's been limited effectively. So once again, it's the right volume. So that is it for the breakdown of Pure Cold. If you want to listen to the song right now, you can on Spotify and a couple other platforms. Yeah, go stream my EP. That's all for now. Peace.